My name is Kara Vincent, and I'm a Knowledge Mobilization Specialist with the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment. Thank you for joining us today for a very important session. I would like to begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. My organization, SIPCERT, has a physical location on Treaty 4 territory, which is the traditional lands of the Nahiawak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota peoples, and the homeland of the Michif Métis. As a nationwide network, we gratefully recognize the privilege of our presence across this beautiful land now known as Canada. SIPCERT acknowledges the importance of the land we each reside upon. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility for honoring relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples that call this nation home. On to some very quick housekeeping. We welcome audience questions and comments. At any time throughout today's event, please feel free to place your questions and comments into the Zoom Q&A box, and we will try to get to them if we can. Today's session is being recorded and will be made available online shortly after the webinar. You'll receive an email notification once the video becomes available. Finally, this event will be presented in English with French translation. Please use the link that I'll place in the chat and follow the instructions, which will enable you to log into our translation platform. And now, with that, I'm very happy to pass this session on to Lisa Delaney, Garnet Families Community Development Lead.
Thanks so much, Kara. We'll just do a quick screen share switch up, hopefully. All good? Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us today for our multidisciplinary panel discussion looking at suicide and suicide prevention through a broader lens that brings families into the frame. We recognize that this is a sensitive and distressing topic and that many people joining us today will have been touched by suicide. The content may be difficult to listen to and may bring up a range of emotions. We encourage you to care for your safety and well-being. If you need support, we have two wonderful clinicians joining us from PSPNet, Melissa and Amelie, who are available for you to connect with throughout the event. As well, there is the 988 crisis line available to everyone across Canada. Melissa and Amelie's contact information will be in the chat for your reference throughout today's presentation. For today's discussion, we are joined by three members of the Garnet Families Families Matter Research Group, Dr. Heidi Cramm, Dr. Margaret Campbell, and Dr. Christine Genest. They will be exploring where and how families fit in suicide prevention within defense and public safety communities, highlight some key issues that emerged throughout the development of the Inside Suicide podcast, soon to be launched, and look forward to where we go next in this work. If you have any questions for the panelists, like Kara mentioned, please put them in the chat and we'll work to answer them closer to the end of the event. Turning it over to Heidi, Margaret, and Christine now.
Thanks, Lisa. And I just wanted to give some kind of historical context about how we got here. And so a number of years ago, I was in a role within the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research. And really, there was a lot of thinking about cross-sector issues. And we actually kind of conceptualized this cross-sector. And at that point, it was, military, veteran, and public safety event to really think about, where and how suicide prevention was being effective, where we needed to go forward. And as a families researcher, it occurred to me after this event kind of happened, and you can see this is 2018 that it launched, that even I hadn't really been thinking about where the families were positioned within this space. So there's a lot of work that's kind of ongoing within these occupational communities around suicide prevention. But it became clear to me that families weren't kind of in the mix. So we're very fortunate to get some funding from the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families. And one of the things that then happened was we started to really try to find in the research literature where and how do families fit. And Lisa, if you can go to the next slide, please. So the beginning of this was really looking at, a scoping review is kind of like a general, what's out there. It's mapping the field to kind of figure this out. And what we discovered when we looked at everything that we could find in English was that families are conceptualized in 3 different kinds of categories. The first one is that they are factors. So this may be a positive factor, like there's a protective factor, where things are going well. If there's a relational discord, they may become a risk factor. Then what we found a lot of was families kind of conceptualized as actors. So they are implicated in the suicide prevention activities. So they would kind of get responsibilized for things like surveillance or restriction of access to means and those types of things, often without any real training or resources, and it's a lot of weight to carry, and it's often very invisible work. And then more recently, we've been looking at how families themselves are impacted by suicidality within these occupational communities. And so that kind of laid the basis for the work that's come. And so one of the things then that's come out of that is a more intensive, like how do we challenge and find ways forward in where and how we think about and talk about where families fit. So over to Margaret.
Thanks, Heidi, for that background. That's really helpful to understand kind of the larger trajectory that we're dealing with today. So I'm going to be speaking to a relatively recent project that Dr. Cramm, myself, and Dr. Genest, along with a whole host of other researchers, helped to create, and that is the Inside Suicide podcast series. So I'm going to give a bit of background about how we devised this series, the different kinds of considerations that we made while working on it, and hopefully kind of whet your appetite to go in there and give it a listen. So as Heidi mentioned, she's been doing a lot of work, a lot of collaborative, interdisciplinary, and international work on where and how families fit in suicide prevention, intervention, postvention, and memorialization. So that's involved a lot of original research, a lot of knowledge synthesis, reviewing literature, speaking with families and organizations. And through that work, as Heidi mentioned, I think we realized something important, that a lot of the conversations around suicide, if they're happening at all, are happening really in silos. Like researchers are talking to researchers, and generally often only within their own discipline. Organizations are talking internally. Maybe they're talking outside of their organization to other organizations. Families, when we look at, where are families in this conversation? Well, they're often sidelined. They're rarely centered. And so we felt we need more crosstalk. We need more engagement with families that's quite authentic and sustained. We really need to center their needs and understandings. And we need crosstalk of an interdisciplinary nature amongst people who are working in this area, that are thinking about families or currently working with families in their practice, in their research, whatever it might be. So, like I say, we wanted to do something different, and realized that there was this real need to further the dialogue or conversations around suicide. We were fortunate enough to have funding from the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families, and launched this project that was designed to really bring these different voices together into direct conversation with one another. So we brought researchers, practitioners, Garnet families themselves together to participate in this podcast and talk explicitly about, well, where do families fit? How do they fit across this spectrum of suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention? So we thought, a podcast would make these insights or these conversations most accessible. And I also want to highlight, before I go further and talk more about the content of the podcast, that we didn't just approach this willy-nilly, right? There's tons of podcasts out there. We don't need to clutter up that space any further. We wanted to be really intentional about how we went organizing and orchestrating this. So we adopted what is known as the deliberative dialogues approach. And this is an approach that's been used in a range of different settings, but we really took a lot of lead or insight from McMaster Health Forum at McMaster University. And deliberative dialogues are a little bit different than your just average conversation or like a lecture or a panel discussion, for example. The idea with a deliberative dialogue is that you're not really aiming for consensus, but what you're aiming to do is to bring together people who are involved in maybe making decisions, they're organizational leaders, people who are affected by those decisions. So in this case, families, and people who are knowledgeable about the issue. So researchers, practitioners, and bringing them all together, right? They're not randomly selected, but they're chosen quite intentionally to ensure this diverse breadth of perspective across people with firsthand experiences, people working in policy, people working in practice or research settings. So like I said, we wanted to bring all of these folks together within this paradigm of the deliberative dialogue approach, which is a little bit different than, like I say, your everyday conversation or a lecture or a panel. They're more structured than maybe a town hall would be. They're more evidence-driven than like an informal discussion, and they're less focused on building consensus. So it's an interesting method that helped to really structure the dialogue. And like I say, we weren't going about this willy-nilly. We had some guiding questions. If we could just move to the next slide, please, and I'll speak through some of these questions, because they correspond to all of the different episodes that we'll talk about. So we had some guiding questions that really grounded our work in this area. These are questions that we sought to answer through these dialogues, and that ultimately became kind of the focus or the theme for the 5 different episodes. So it's a 5-part series, and each episode kind of takes on a new question. So the first episode explores, how can a family-centered approach be integrated into suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention? And what is a family-centered approach anyway? Like, what does that actually look like? We really wanted to tease this apart and get a better sense of what this means. And for us, really, a family-centered approach reframes suicide as not solely an individual level issue, but something that's embedded in familial context, organizational context, that is multifactorial. And a family-centered lens also involves really, thinking about how we design our intervention or response systems in ways that really foreground the needs of families. Because as Heidi mentioned earlier, they tend to be sidelined. So if we could just kind of go through, that was really, and those are some of the issues that really come to the foreground in episode 1. In episode 2, we're kind of asking this question, well, what are the strengths and what are the limitations of existing approaches to understanding suicide? Like, how do we know what we know? So for this question in episode 2, we really wanted to understand where are the areas that we're doing well and where are there areas for improvement. So, there is this growing recognition that suicide is something that's multidimensional and does affect families. But we saw that there was room for improvement with regards to how Garnet families are represented. They're generally just not there in the research, in policy, or in our frameworks for understanding or responding to suicide loss. For episode 3, we were exploring, well, what tensions and opportunities kind of exist around memorialization and commemorization of suicide deaths. Or excuse me, that was for episode 4. So in episode 3, we kind of look at, again, shifting our perspective and how we study suicide death. How can we bring families into the frame? How can we incorporate lived experience into knowledge production and the research studies that we do, or in developing policy within organizations in a way that's really authentic and meaningful? So episode 4, if we could shift to the next bullet point, this is where we get into some of those tensions around memorialization and commemorization. And I think this is perhaps one of my favorite episodes because, again, we're not coming to consensus here, but we can make some clear recommendations around memorialization, some of the tensions here. Right? Like, often we see that recognition following a suicide death, if it's recognized at all, because there is this history of failing to recognize them, that recognition is maybe there immediately after the death, but can fade away quickly. And families are living with this loss indefinitely. So there's really some opportunity there for embedding supports into a more long-term strategy for supporting families. There's opportunities for co-designing memorial practices that can include families as kind of equal partners. So there's a lot of opportunity when it comes to thinking about memorialization and commemoration. And episode 5, all right, our 5th and final episode, a new line of sight, looking towards pathways ahead. We wanted to be kind of thinking about, well, what promising practices in suicide prevention can be adapted to or expanded to better include Garnet families specifically. So we wanted to better understand, like, again, where are some opportunities here for roads ahead and pathways forward. So in total, the series, it's 5 episodes, but it brings together about 20 different participants that represent, I think, almost more than 10 or about 10 different academic disciplines or perspectives. And that's alongside the lived experience of family members. It is international in its scope. I think we had 4 different countries represented that kind of allowed us to tease apart some of the challenges that are maybe specific to our Canadian context, but that also resonate in other contexts as well. I'm going to wind down here and pass it over to my colleague, Christine, in a moment, but I just want to highlight some of the themes that emerged really across the podcast. So as Heidi mentioned, families are kind of invisible to us in many ways, and they're also instrumental. They're already doing the work of suicide intervention and prevention and response. So we had to kind of deal with this complexity and wrestle with this a little bit. And it became pretty apparent to us that families want to be recognized as having their own needs, right? Garnet families are not just extensions of the serving member. They deserve attention in their own right. They have unique experiences, vulnerabilities, and expertise that I think we've yet to really tap into. And that's part of what we were trying to do with this podcast. Another thing that came clear for us is that families want guidance. They want clearer guidance and more involvement, and more, I would say, like organizational alignment, and not just during times of crisis, but before and long after as well. And as I alluded before, I think families are looking to be more meaningfully included in these opportunities for memorialization. And I know this is something that Christine is going to talk about here in just a minute. But I think this series is part of what we're really trying to do in shifting the lens to genuinely center families, to better understand, well, what does it mean to center families? Because that's a pretty diverse thing, right? And really, we wanted to change how we understand suicide prevention and response by centering the unique needs and experiences of Garnet families. So I know Christine is going to speak more to memorialization, commemoration, and some of the other research work that we've been doing in this area. But I'll end with just a final plug. The podcast is, like I say, accessible widely to folks. It's in both audio and visual format. And the other note that I'll just say that we designed this knowing that it's not something that you maybe passively engage in, but are really quite intentional about, when do I have the opportunity to actually plug in and listen to episode 1? When do I need to maybe take a pause? So yeah, I'll stop there. And appreciate the opportunity to speak about what I think is a really important and timely set of conversations.
Thanks, Margaret. So as Margaret told, it's not an endpoint. This project, the Inside Suicide project, is not the endpoint. It moves us toward next steps. It allows us to identify critical areas where further research is needed to better equip families and public safety organizations in the prevention of suicide. Building on this work, a research project is currently underway to better understand and respond to suicide death within the organization. It's really important, this project, because families are the one who must live with the consequence of suicide. Suicide bereavement is a particular grief in itself. It's an extremely painful experience, and it is not lived solely within the family, within the private spheres of the family, because in those cases, when it's public safety personnel that die by suicide, families must also navigate it through societal and organizational framework that shape how that death is publicly understood and remembered. So the way that organization will respond to the suicide death, the memorialization of this kind of death can significantly influence how family experience grief. But there is, as Margaret told us, there's little consensus on how suicidal death should be recognized and commemorated within the organization. This is a lack of consensus that can lead to variation in practice, and that can also bring family to feel a sense of inequities in how their close one is remembered within the organization and within different kind of death also. In the past few years in Canada, there's an increasing effort to better acknowledge and recognize death by suicide within the organization. However, because suicide is still a taboo, there's the effort needs to evolve and to continue. We should reflect on how suicide deaths are acknowledged within our own organization and whether this is different from how other kind of work-related deaths are recognized also. Like I know that now, like for the firefighter memorials, they now acknowledge the firefighter that died by suicide, but it's not in every workforce that it's the same way. So there's like a reflection to have on how this is, because for the family, it's also a way that their close ones are remembered, and it's a kind of support that they might have if this is recognized. When we're thinking about commemoration, memorialization, the goal is not to portray the individual as an hero, because we don't want to have like a contagious effect, but it's rather to acknowledge the loss in a way that is comparable to other deaths, while remaining attentive to those individuals who may be particularly vulnerable and deeply affected by the suicide. Because when one suicide arrive in a workforce or in a family, other individuals are impacted by that death, and they may become more vulnerable themselves to suicide. So this kind of event can bring vulnerabilities to other. So it's like it might be a good organizational time to have this look around to see which person might need some help at that point. Recognizing suicide in an equitable and thoughtful manner can also create opportunities to identify and support those that may be struggling. And it's really important to put the family in the center of this reflection and in this discussion to better understand what they want and what they need in this way of commemoration, because they are the one who will be struggling and will be living this event in the few days, months, and even years following the death by suicide. A second research angle that we have in the past few years is to look at the suicidality of those Garnet Families members. Are they represented in the literature? What is their suicidality? How many of them had suicidal behaviors? How many of them may die by suicide also? What we find out is that families members, as Heidi told us previously, families members are not only protective or risk factor, they are not only like partner in suicide prevention. They are themselves also impacted by the work environment of their close one, and they themselves be impacted by the suicidality of their close one. So they may also have experienced themselves suicidal behavior. The existing literature on suicidality among families members of public safety personnel remain very limited, and mostly it came from the US. When the topic is addressed, research mostly focus on spouse and children, but they are not the only members of families of public safety personnel and military and veteran. There might be parents also, there might be brother and sisters. So when we're thinking about suicidality of family member, we may try to have a more broadened lens to look at all those persons that are navigating throughout the person that is working in the public safety personnel and military environment. The gap in the literature, this gap in the literature also raised important question about whose experience are being recognized, whose needs remain invisible, and how support and prevention effort could be expanded to better reflect the broader family system. In the new environment that we are, there's no one size of family. There's like an heterogeneity of who are the family members, and we should be looking at all these perspectives. So there must be new research done around who are the ones that are part of the family and who we want to look at for suicide prevention, and not only focusing on public safety personnel. It's a population that is at risk, but there's all those people surrounding them that might be needing some help also and some research done on them. So those are the two research perspectives that we'll be looking for in the next few years also. So sending it back to you, Heidi. I don't know if you want to add some point, or Margaret on the memorialization, if you had some point that you want to add on.
Thanks, Christine and Margaret. I think the memorialization has been a really complicated process. So recognizing that there's a lot of tensions in the communities, and there will, kind of like the deliberate dialogue when Margaret was saying, we don't expect consensus. And I don't think that we'll ever achieve consensus on the kinds of memorialization standards. because there are different perspectives within the community and across different sectors. So while that's true, I think that we can also think about where are there places for common ground, and how do we support the families who are bereaved by suicide? As Christine, mentions, it's a special kind of grief, and when it happens in these sectors, there are additional variables in how that grief is experienced and processed. It's in the public eye in a way that it might not be elsewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Heidi, just to jump in here. Like you said, public eye. And I think we need more work and attention in this area. Also because of the way in which we grieve has changed radically due to social media and information communication technologies like Facebook and Instagram, what have you. So increasingly our grieving isn't just carried out, offline, but online as well. And we see a lot of online memorials, online tributes. So I think this is kind of a really pressing, there's a pressing need to explore some of these issues and acknowledge that social media can kind of amplify both opportunities for memorialization, but also the challenges that we're facing. So I think it's really interesting. I'll do a bit of a shameless plug here because I think there's a lot of work needed in this area from multiple perspectives, as you folks have noted, from families themselves and a diverse range of families, and seeing that operationalized in broad ways, but also from organizations, because families are struggling with memorializing their loved one who has died by suicide in ways that feel true and respectful to the life that they lived, but also the way in which they died. And so are organizations. Organizations are faced with some real challenges here. So Dr. Cramm, myself, and a group of other researchers, Dr. Genest is also on this project. We're currently working on a study that's funded by the Canadian Institute for Health Research. And it's a two-pronged research project. One side is carried out by Dr. Simon Hatcher at the Hatching Ideas Lab and the Ottawa Health Research Institute. And that side is really looking at, well, how do families experience suicide loss? So how do Garnet families experience the loss of a serving member? And how do they want their loved one memorialized? What were their experiences of memorialization? Was their loved one memorialized at all? So really that side is tapping into the family level experiences with regards to grief, bereavement, memorialization. And the other prong, the other side of the project is looking at organizational responses. So what resources do organizations have to use this? Like our sense, our kind of guess is that a lot of people are doing this work off their desk, off the side of their desk. But there isn't a lot of policy that people can rely on to guide their actions. And while we don't see like a one size fits all, rubber stamp for this kind of situation, we do think that organizations probably would like some guidance, and we'd like to have a better sense of what went well in your organization, what didn't go so well. So we're doing some research on this area, and if you would maybe be eligible to participate, maybe you're a family member, or maybe you're part of an organization in which you have taken on a role where you've responded to a suicide death, we would love to speak with you, very much so. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us, and we will send you some additional information about that research project. Like I say, Dr. Cramm, myself, and Dr. Genest are really looking more on the organizational response side of things, and looking to support organizations with how they respond.
And this kind of preparation for postvention, like how we react when a suicide happens, is really important to have this preparation prior and before, because when suicide happens, it's like a crisis that it's happening in the organization, and people are reacting like in front of this big crisis, and you do the best you can, but with like the crisis experience surrounding you. And afterward, when you have finished and everything is done, you're so exhausted that you don't have time to like reflect on how it's happened and what were the good things that you've done, what should be improved and all that. So by having it prepared prior, just thinking about who's going to be the one communicating with the family, or who's going to be the one reaching out to people, all that should be done prior. And even within the organization, what would be done to help the colleague and all that. And in Quebec, there's like this postvention program that has been developed. It's not specific for public safety personnel, but there's this postvention program that's been developed for a different organization. And something that is brought up by this program is that the intervention should be extended up to 1 year after the death by suicide, because there might be some need, not just in the few days, few weeks, but until 1 year afterward.
Well, and I can speak to that because the Ontario government has extended some of the work that's available, and Lisa might remember some of the details on this in terms of it goes back, I think, now to 2002 for folks in Ontario.
I have to double check, but I will do that. But yes, it extended quite a few years.
Yeah, because sometimes the services were extended, up to 2 years. And certainly when I completed the Surviving Families program evaluation, what I found is a lot of people couldn't really start experiencing that grief until 2 years after the death. And sometimes that was because they had children and they, had to kind of sort out the kids. And that was more present for them than the ability to find that space and time for themselves to really kind of process their grief. And I think it's one of those things that, when we talk about suicide and we talk about grief, there are resources out there. And certainly, the conversation that we're trying to change through the podcast, just a shout out to Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families, because we're going to have a lot of material that comes out related to, written summaries, different kinds of ways to help us get that word out. And I think that there will be some more of what we call like knowledge products in the coming weeks and months around this topic, and our collaboration with Atlas around this project. So I think it's kind of one of these spaces to continue to watch, because there's going to be a lot more coming, and we're going to be able to invite people to listen to the podcast and to share their feedback, because we want to hear how it lands with people, and we want to understand and take direction on kind of what the next batches of research projects need to be. So I think that's all very important. Lisa, were you able to find that? You want to share that? We could probably put that in the chat as well. It's a good point.
It's the Ontario Family Wellness, and it dates back to January 2020. I think we are in the process of putting it in the chat right now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So opening up that eligibility for people to be able to access those services, 2020, not 2002. Is that right?
2000, sorry, January 1st, 2000, and eligible family members may access the program for up to 10 years from their registration date. Yeah, sorry.
So yeah, fair enough. And I'm just asking you in real time. It's like, hey, that thing that we should have put in here. But this is why the conversations matter, because there's so much happening in this space. It was like, yes, that's important, and maybe we can find the information for those in Quebec as well for that service that Christine is offering, and we can put that up as well. But I think it does take us to just see if there are any questions in the chat. Just take a moment. I don't see any at this time. But maybe we go to the next slide and invite those kinds of time for questions. What's on the next one? Technology will work for us, right? It's going to happen. Aha, there we go. So this is some of the information about some of these resources. And one of the things that we have found in our kind of, 5 years that I've been working in this area, and Christine, I know for longer, is that there have been some really good resources and supports that have been developed, but very few people actually know about them. So the 988 was a massive consolidation of all helplines, crisis lines in Canada. So it doesn't matter where you call in, you'll be routed geographically to something that is proximal to your phone number. So that's really helpful. And there have been efforts to create some specialized 988 kind of lines and capacity for people coming from public safety, which is a new kind of initiative that's, I think, still underway. I think the Frontline Families Canada, that's a very popular camp. They're full already for this summer, is my understanding. They have a call out for volunteers for anyone who wants to help with the camps, but I think they're looking into next year already for camp registration. The Surviving Family Program, I've done the program evaluation on that, and I found it was people generally have a very, very positive experience in having that space and time to really sit with processing their grief. And I've been very impressed by Claudine and Carolyn, who are very skilled facilitators in that intensive 5-day clinically facilitated program. And then, of course, the QR code is there for the Inside Suicide podcast. So this will take you to all episodes. So you'll be able to download wherever you get your podcast. You'll be able to find it. As Margaret has said, it's available widely now. So I think those are all excellent. And then the About Grief and Canadian Virtual Hospice, they have really an amazing array of resources. So Margaret and Christine, just invite you to jump in, add in. We can chat through any of these things.
We have also mentioned the suicidepoint.ca, that is the Quebec platform for suicide prevention, but you can reach out to this platform even if you're not from Quebec, and it's bilingual. So there's services for people if you are like yourself having suicidal ideation, but it can also be used if you're afraid for someone close to you about suicide, or if you are bereaved. So there's that 3-part that can be accessed with a lot of resources. So that could be also interesting to go look at this platform.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an especially useful resource because so many of the resources, or at least in the history of just focusing on like intense crisis periods, but we do know that people need to be resourced outside of these moments of crisis. And for families, particularly Garnet families, I think there's these additional complexities around help seeking and barriers to support, barriers to receiving support that is tailored to their unique needs and that gets it, like the Wounded Warriors program would, because that is really tailored to this population. So I think when we look at the landscape of supports, unfortunately, we do have to recognize that there is this lack of like tailored supports to Garnet families themselves, with the exception of some folks that are doing some really amazing work. And at the same time, what's interesting that came out of the podcast, or really resonated with me at least, was that it's often the grassroots work of families themselves that participate in organizations like Beyond the Blue, or give their time over and create memorials. So I'm tuning in here from the East Coast. Years ago, we had a horrific tragedy in Moncton involving the deaths of many RCMP members, and that was memorialized in different ways. So just seeing the ways in which communities and families participate in the memorialization process, whether or not it's a death by suicide or another kind of death, it just really brings home that despite often their invisibility and the ways in which they're pushed to the periphery, they are doing this work, often quietly and in ways that aren't noticed. But that was something that came out of the podcast for me was just kind of this reflection on, oh goodness, it's often the work of bereaved families themselves that are trying to create services or supports that didn't exist for them. The other point I'll just make about this list is, Heidi, you kind of emphasized this already, but Canadian Virtual Hospice is doing some really novel and cool work and very sector-specific work. The last time we met with them, they were talking about creating a quilt that you could kind of participate in memorializing a veteran who had died by suicide. So some really interesting projects. And it just goes back to this point about like grief not just being contained to with the offline, but is something that we increasingly, that's mediated through different technologies. And Canadian Virtual Hospice would be an interesting example of just the ways in which we're doing this work. And I think these resources, the last thing I'll say, are so important because the grief, the kind of loss that these families are dealing with is a disenfranchised grief. It's one that's not widely acknowledged. And that really, I think, truncates people's ability to actually navigate and process and deal with their grief. So having resources there that acknowledge the unique nature of this loss, the specific complexities for Garnet families, is just so important.
Yeah, I agree. Can I add one thing there on Margaret's help seeking? I think that within these communities, the stoicism that is socialized, broadly and internalized, that you have to deal with it kind of yourself, really kind of amplifies some of these challenges and demands on the families. Christine?
And one of the problem with suicide death is the fact that the person leave out with all the answers to the question. So for family members, sometimes it's really hard because they have some question, they want to get some, they have some question and they want to get some answers, but they won't never get all the answer that they want. So that's why reaching out to others and seeing that they are not alone in that struggle and that others are living the same experience of them might be really useful for them to normalize all those emotions that they might be living. It's really important. So those resources can be really helpful for those bereaved.
Wonderful.
And
Okay,
I
we
just
invite
wanted-
questions to the chat. Sorry, go
I
ahead.
was just going to add, Melissa shared with us memorialgrant.ca. So we're going to add that into the chat. As you can see, we learn about resources that are available in real time. So before we share this slide deck, I will update it with all of these wonderful things because we know families and organizations need this navigational support to find all of these things, links out in one place. So we're working to do that as well. Over to you, Heidi. If there's any final thoughts. I don't see any questions.
I don't see any questions. And I would say it's not uncommon for people to not have questions after we spend a chunk of time sitting with this really heavy topic. So we do invite you to reach out to us as individuals. If you want to talk about any of the research, the support is there with Mel and Amelie. But these are things that we need to have more conversations about more openly as we go forward.
Absolutely. I think just going back to one more plug about the Inside Suicide, but there is this perception that talking about suicide will somehow, contribute to suicidality, but it's the ways in which we talk about suicide, right? And having this deliberate approach, like the one that we took for the series. So it's been such a pleasure to participate in these conversations. And to do some of that work. And as Christine mentioned, these are, just a starting place. And the hope is that we take these conversations, these dialogues from like the podcast format into the home. into the workplace, into your communities, and actually start to, think about, well, how can we kind of turn this into something that's sustained? How can we take these conversations and turn them into action and get some traction there? So
Mhm.
I think we're not getting questions because everyone's gone off to listen to the podcast. We've done just such a great job of selling it. That's my hope, at least.
Christine, any final words before Lisa closes us out?
No, I think it's really important to keep this conversation going on, and it's kind of sometimes difficult to have this conversation, but it's really like if we want to lessen the stigma and the taboo around suicide, we should keep this conversation going and be conscious of everyone around us, even the colleague, but also the family, to make sure that everyone stays safe, even if the work context may be difficult.
Mhm.
Thanks to all of you for sharing your knowledge of this sensitive and topic. Oh, Heidi, is everything okay? We really appreciate everyone logging on today, and for Amelie and Melissa joining us as well. As we mentioned, Heidi, Christine, and Margaret are available for email connections post-event. And we really want you to stay connected. This conversation is ongoing. This series that we've developed is really a conversation starters, and we know that there's more research, more resources, more knowledge to share. So I put up our mailing list with as well as a QR code that gives you access to our link tree so that you can find the social media accounts, our website, and contact us directly. So thank you all, and that's all from me. Take care, everyone.